Eleanor Hayes had paid $9 for the deed, and the clerk in Redwater had laughed doing it. $9 for 30 acres of scrub grass, a 2-story house, and a barn nobody had opened in 10 years. It was, the clerk said, the cheapest mistake in the county. She did not think of it as a mistake. She thought of it as the only door still open to her. Her husband had been dead 6 months, taken by fever, on a cattle drive that should have made him money and instead left her with debts and a folded deed she had not known existed until a lawyer's letter arrived. The land had come from a cousin none of them had ever met, a man named Josiah Marsh, who had left it behind along with a family nobody in town liked to discuss. The wagon driver would not take her all the way to the house. He stopped a half-mile short, at the top of a low rise, and would not explain why, beyond a single sentence. "Ma'am," he said, not looking at her, "get inside before dark, and whatever you do, don't go near that barn." Then he turned his team around and left her standing in the dust with her trunk and a rifle she did not yet know how to load properly. The house was better kept than she expected, and that unsettled her more than ruin would have. Someone had left it clean. 2 plates still sat on the kitchen table, food long since turned to hard, dark crust, as though a meal had been abandoned mid-bite and no one had ever come back to clear it. She lit a single lamp before dusk, swallowed the windows whole. The barn stood across the yard, a black shape against a bruised sky, its door shut with an iron bar someone had set in place long ago and never lifted since. She told herself the fear was only the fear of any woman alone in an unfamiliar house. She told herself this twice, then a third time, and by the third time she almost believed it. Sleep came slowly and left quickly. She woke to a sound she could not place at first, low, metallic, deliberate. Not the wind, not a loose shutter, a bell. One long, heavy toll. Then silence, then another. It came from the barn. Eleanor sat upright in the dark, her heart working harder than the sound warranted. She told herself it was a loose rope, a bell swinging free in the wind. But there had been no wind that night. She remembered noting its absence. Before she slept, the strange total stillness of the yard. She went to the window. The barn was a shape and nothing more, the moon too thin to show detail. The bell rang a third time and then stopped and did not ring again. She did not go outside. She sat with the lamp burning until the sky grayed toward morning, and only then did her shoulders loosen enough to let her breathe without counting the seconds between each breath. By the time the sun was fully up, she had convinced herself once more that some ordinary thing explained it. A hinge come loose, some animal caught inside the barn walls she had not yet found. She dressed, made coffee from what supplies she had carried in her trunk, and told herself the day would look less frightening than the night had. A knock came at the door before the coffee had finished boiling. The man on her porch was younger than she expected a neighbor to be, sun-browned from years outdoors, his hair a light sandy brown beneath a worn hat. He held his reins loosely, his horse cropping at the dry grass near the steps. "Name's Caleb Whitfield," he said. "Run the Circle K, other side of the ridge. Heard someone had come to take the Marsh place." He looked past her, toward the barn, and something in his face tightened before he could stop it. "Didn't expect anyone to stay past one night. I intend to stay a good deal longer than that, Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor said. He nodded slowly, as if that answer troubled him more than it satisfied him. "You hear anything, ma'am? Last night?" Eleanor's mouth went dry before she answered. "A bell." Caleb did not look surprised. That was the worst part. The absence of surprise, the way his jaw set, as though a fact he already knew had simply been confirmed aloud. "That bell's hung on that barn 10 years, he said, "and in 10 years nobody's touched it. Nobody living, at least." "What happened to the family before me?" Eleanor asked. "The Marshes." Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. "Gone," he said finally. "One night, near as anyone can tell, wagons still in the yard, stock still in the pens, supper still on the table. From what I heard, though I never went in myself to check." Eleanor thought of the 2 plates in her kitchen. The food turned to stone. Where did they go? "Nobody knows," Caleb said. "And nobody around here asks too loud. Folks who ask questions about the Marsh place tend to find their own nights get a little louder after." He looked at her a moment longer, as if weighing whether to say more, then touched the brim of his hat instead. "You want help closing that place up proper and moving back to town? I'll bring my wagon myself. No charge. I'm not leaving, Mr. Whitfield." Something crossed his face that might have been respect, or might have been pity. "Then keep your lamp lit," he said, "and don't go in that barn after dark, whatever you hear." He mounted his horse and rode off without waiting for her answer, leaving her alone with the silence of the yard and the shape of the barn standing black against the morning light. The second visitor came 3 days later in a fine black carriage that had no business on roads this rough. Eleanor watched it come from a mile off, a thin line of dust rising behind it like smoke from something burning slow. The man who stepped down wore a gray suit too clean for the dirt he stood on. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Cross, representative of the Cross Mining and Land Company, and he smiled the way men smile when they have never once been told no and do not expect to hear it now. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, removing his hat with theatrical care, "I understand you've taken possession of the old Marsh property." "I have. $200, cash, today, no questions asked about the state of the house or what you may or may not have found here." Eleanor studied him. "Why would a mining company want 30 acres of grass and a broken-down barn, Mr. Cross?" His smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. Sentiment. Mrs. Hayes, nothing more. She did not believe him, and she suspected he did not expect her to. Men like Cross did not deal in sentiment. They dealt in leverage, and the ease of his offer told her the land was worth far more than $200 to somebody. "I'll keep the land, Mr. Cross," she said. For the first time, his expression cooled. "You should think carefully before refusing me, Mrs. Hayes. This is not friendly country for a woman living alone. Things happen out here that town folk don't like to speak of. Is that a warning or a threat?" "It's a fact," Cross said. "The Marsh family learned it the hard way. I'd hate for you to learn it the same." He replaced his hat, bowed his head with mocking politeness, and returned to his carriage. Eleanor stood in the yard long after the dust of his wheels had settled, turning his words over until they lost their shape and became only sound. "A fact," he'd said, "not a warning." She did not know which possibility frightened her more. That night, for the first time, the animals in the small paddock beside the house screamed. It began just past midnight, the same hour. She would later realize that the bell had rung 3 nights before. The 2 horses she'd inherited with the deed threw themselves against the paddock rails hard enough that the wood cracked, and their screaming had a pitch to it Eleanor had never heard from any animal, something closer to human terror than instinct. She ran out with the lamp, and by the time she reached the fence, the horses had gone still, trembling, lathered with sweat, though the night was cool. She found no wolf, no cat, no tracks. she could make sense of in the dark. Only the horses, wild-eyed, refusing to look toward the barn. She followed their gaze anyway. The barn door, the one barred from the outside, the one she had not touched since arriving, stood open by perhaps a foot. The iron bar that should have held it shut, lying in the dirt several feet away, as though it had been lifted and simply dropped. She did not go closer. She backed toward the house, lamp shaking in her hand, and bolted the door behind her, though she knew, with a certainty that frightened her more than the open barn itself, that a bolted door had not helped whoever lived here before. She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the rifle across her knees, though she still was not entirely certain she could fire it if the need came. The house made its ordinary sounds, the settling of old wood, the tick of a cooling stove, and each one struck her like a gunshot. Near dawn, exhaustion finally pulled her under for perhaps an hour. When she woke, gray light was pushing through the curtains, and she made herself go out to look at the barn in daylight, when at least the shape of things could be trusted. The bar lay where it had fallen. The door stood open the same foot it had been in the night. Inside, she could see only darkness and the suggestion of old stalls, empty for a decade. She did not go in. She told herself it was because the light was still too poor and did not examine that excuse too closely. She found instead a single line of footprints leading from the barn door toward the dry creek bed behind the property, bare feet by the shape of them pressed deep into ground that had not seen rain in weeks. They stopped abruptly 100 feet out in open ground, as though whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. Mid-stride, she rode to Caleb's ranch that afternoon and found herself grateful to arrive somewhere with other voices, other faces, the ordinary business of cattle and rope and daylight. Caleb listened to her account without interrupting, his jaw tightening at the mention of the footprints. Bare feet, he repeated, ending in open ground. You've heard this before. He was quiet a long moment. The Marsh boy, he said finally, youngest of them. Before they all vanished, there was talk, just talk, mind of him walking out at night. Sleepwalking, some said. Others said something else walked him. He looked at her directly. I'm not a superstitious man, Mrs. Hayes, but I've lived next to that ground my whole life, and I've learned not to need an explanation for everything I choose to stay away from. Cross wants the land, Eleanor said, badly enough to threaten me for it. Then you've got two things to be afraid of out there, Caleb said quietly, and I couldn't tell you for certain which one you should fear more. Amos Tillman lived alone in a line shack 2 miles from town, and the boys at the feed store told Eleanor he was the last man still living who had worked at the Marsh place before the family disappeared. She found him mending a saddle on his porch, a thin, white-haired man whose eyes seemed to focus on something a good distance behind whatever he was actually looking at. He did not seem surprised to see her. You're the one bought the Hollow Belt place, he said, before she had introduced herself. Eleanor Hayes. Sit if you want. Won't take long to tell you what I know, and less time for you to wish you hadn't asked. She sat. He did not look up from his work as he spoke, as though the saddle in his hands gave him something to hold on to that the story did not. I worked for Josiah Marsh 11 years, Amos said. Good man. Not a fool. Whatever folks say now to make themselves feel better about what happened. Something changed out there the last year I worked it. Started small, a bell that rang when no one was near it. Stock spooked at the same hour every night, like clockwork. Josiah dug near the old creek bed, looking for water, found something else instead. What did he find? Eleanor asked. Amos's hands. stopped moving on the leather. I don't rightly know how to say it, so it sounds like sense, he said. A hollow, old, dug out long before any of us were born, walled up with stone that didn't match anything a rancher would build. Josiah didn't tell me much about what was inside it. Only that after he found it, he stopped sleeping through the night, and he started keeping that barn door barred from the outside, which any man will tell you is a strange way to keep something out, seeing as a bar on the outside only serves to keep something in. The words settled over Eleanor like cold water. You think something was kept in that barn. I think a man doesn't bar a door from the wrong side unless he's more afraid of what's behind it, walking out, than of anything walking in, Amos said. That's all I'll say, plain. The rest is guessing, and I've done enough guessing these 10 years to last a lifetime. And the company man, Cross, did he ever come around? Back then, Amos's face changed at the name, the first flicker of something sharper than caution. Cross was here before Josiah found that hollow, he said. Cross knew what was under that ground. Long before any marsh dug it up, I'd stake what's left of my life on that. What happened the night they disappeared? Eleanor asked. I wasn't there, Amos said. Thank God, or whatever's left listening. I'd quit 2 weeks before, told Josiah I couldn't do it anymore. Hearing that bell every night, watching the horses go wild at the same hour like they were set by a clock nobody could see. He didn't blame me for going. Told me a man ought to protect his own sleep. He set the saddle aside, finally, folding his hands. 2 weeks later, a drover passed through and found the place empty. Wagon still there, stock still penned, near starved but alive. Supper on the table, gone to rot. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just gone, like they'd stepped out mid-meal and never stepped back in. And no one searched. They searched, Amos said. Found those same bare footprints you're describing, out past the creek bed. Found them stop dead in open ground, same as you say. After that, the sheriff at the time called it a family that ran off from debts, wrote it in his report, and closed the matter. Cross's company bought mineral rights on half the county not 2 months later. Convenient. That timing, if you care to notice it the way I did. Eleanor rode back toward Hollow Bell as the light began to lean gold across the hills, turning the details of Amos's story over with each mile. A hollow beneath the creek bed, old before any settler's memory. A bar set the wrong way on a door. A company man who knew what lay beneath the ground before anyone had dug it up. And beneath all of it, still unexplained, the bell ringing at the same hour, night after night, for reasons neither superstition nor plain greed accounted for entirely. She did not believe in ghosts, not in the way the Sunday preacher warned against believing, but she had also stopped believing that everything frightening needed a name to be real. Some things, she was beginning to understand, simply were present, patient, indifferent to whether a person had a word for them or not. She reached the ranch as the sun touched the ridge, and before she had even unsaddled her horse, she noticed the barn door standing open again, the fallen bar untouched from where she'd left it that morning. She had not opened it. No one had come. And yet there it stood, open exactly as wide as it had been the night before, as if something had checked and found the gap still sufficient and left it exactly as is. That night, she did not sit at the kitchen table. She sat instead at the upstairs window where she could watch both the yard and the barn without exposing herself to whatever might be watching back. She had brought the rifle loaded this time, though her hands still were not steady with it. Midnight came slow, marked only by the position of the moon, rather than any clock she owned. When the bell rang, one heavy toll, then a pause, then a second. She made herself watch instead of flinching away from the window. She saw no figure, no shape crossing the yard, no shadow breaking from the barn's black doorway, only the sound itself, moving through the still air with a weight that seemed wrong for a simple piece of iron and rope. And then, just as the second toll faded, she heard something else, faint, carried on no wind she could feel, a long, low sound that was almost a breath and almost a word, and gone before she could decide. It had been either. She sat awake until dawn once more, and in the gray light that followed, she made a decision she suspected Amos Tillman would have called reckless, and Caleb Whitfield would have called worse. She decided to go into the barn. She waited for full daylight, when the sun stood high enough to throw its light through the barn's high, dust-caked windows. She told no one her plan. Not trusting either man to let her go through with it if she asked first, she brought the lamp anyway, though she told herself it was only a precaution. The barn smelled of old hay, long since rotted to dust, and beneath that, something fainter, mineral, faintly sweet, like wet stone. The stalls stood empty, exactly as Caleb had described the Marsh family leaving them, not abandoned in disorder, but closed up with a peculiar, unsettling neatness, as though someone had tidied the space before whatever happened. At the rear of the barn, past the last stall, she found a trapdoor set into the floor, its edges worn smooth by more traffic than a simple barn floor should have seen. A length of rope lay coiled beside it, old but not as old as the rest of the barn's abandoned fittings. Rope someone had used more recently than 10 years past. She stood over the trapdoor a long while before she found the will to lift it. Beneath the floor, a narrow shaft dropped into darkness deeper than her lamp could meaningfully answer. Cold air rose from it, carrying that same faint mineral smell, stronger now, and beneath it, so quiet she could not be certain she hadn't imagined it, the suggestion of movement, not footsteps, not breathing exactly, but a kind of settling, as though something large had shifted its position somewhere below and gone still again. The moment she noticed, she did not climb down. She told herself this was caution and not cowardice, though she was no longer certain the two were different things in a place like this. She lowered the lamp instead, as far as her arm would reach, and in its narrow circle of light, she saw the walls of the shaft were not dirt, as she'd expected, but stacked stone, fitted with a precision no rancher's tools could have managed. Old stone, patient stone, the same kind Amos had described Josiah Marsh uncovering by the creek bed. This was not a well. It had never been a well. Something had built this on purpose, long before any bell had ever been hung above it. She pulled the lamp back up, closed the trapdoor, and left the barn faster than dignity would generally allow. Caleb arrived that evening unannounced, and later admitted he'd ridden over on instinct alone, unable to shake the feeling that something in the day had gone wrong on her land without his knowing what. She told him what she had found. He listened with his jaw set so tight she worried he might crack a tooth. "You went down there. I looked. I didn't climb down." "Small mercies," he said, though his relief did not fully reach his eyes. "That shaft, I've heard the old-timers speak of something like it my whole life, always half joking, the way men joke about things they're afraid to take seriously. Called it the Marsh Hollow. Said Josiah found something under this ground that had been here longer than any of us. And once a thing like that gets found, it gets noticed, I suppose is the word. Noticed by whoever wants it kept quiet, and noticed by whatever's underneath it, both at the same time, like finding it wakes two different kinds of trouble." Cross knew, Eleanor said. Amos was certain of it. Then Cross has spent 10 years waiting for someone foolish enough, or desperate enough, to buy this land and dig where the Marsh family already paid the price for digging. Caleb's voice was low. You need to think hard, Mrs. Hayes, about which is more dangerous to you, the man in the fine suit, or whatever's under that barn floor that made a family disappear without a drop of blood spilled. That night, the bell rang earlier than before, not at midnight, but an hour past sundown, while there was still enough gray light left in the sky to see the yard clearly from the window. Eleanor and Caleb both watched it happen, the heavy iron tongue of the bell swinging once, fully, without wind, once fully, without wind, without any hand visible on the rope, and the sound rolling out across the yard exactly as it had every night before. This time, Caleb did not hesitate the way Eleanor had. He crossed the yard fast, lamp raised, and reached the barn, just as the door, already ajar from her earlier visit, swung another foot open, as though pushed from within by something that withdrew the instant light touched the gap. He found no one inside, no animal, no intruder, no sign of a rope pulled by human hands anywhere near the bell's mechanism. What he did find, pressed fresh into the dust of the barn floor, was a second set of footprints, bare, small, childlike in their shape, leading from the trapdoor toward the open door and stopping, as the others had, at the threshold, as though whatever made them had simply ceased partway through a step. A child, Eleanor said. When Caleb described what he'd found, her voice was barely above a whisper. The Marsh boy. Amos said he used to walk at night. 10 years is a long time for a set of prints to stay fresh in dust. Nobody's disturbed, Caleb said. He would not meet her eyes as he said it, as if some part of him did not want to finish the thought aloud. I don't have an answer for you, Mrs. Hayes. I've lived beside this ground my whole life, and I've never once had an answer. All I've ever had is the good sense to stay off it after dark. They searched the rest of the barn together before full night fell, methodical, refusing to let fear rush the work. In the loft, tucked beneath a rotted stack of feed sacks, they found a tin box, its lid rusted nearly shut, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a ledger in a careful hand, Josiah Marsh's hand. Caleb confirmed, having seen the man's writing on old feed receipts years before. The final pages were not about cattle or grain. They were about the hollow beneath the creek, and about a man named Nathaniel Cross, who had come around asking questions about it 2 full years before Josiah's family vanished. The ledger's last entry, dated 11 days before the disappearance, was short. The handwriting hurried in a way the earlier pages were not. Cross came again today. It read, offered to buy the North 30 for triple its worth. No explanation given. I told him no. Same as the last 3 times. He said I'd regret it, and for the first time I believed he meant something more than money. The bell rang twice last night, though I checked the rope myself before bed and found it tied exactly as I'd left it. Something has been testing the barn door each night this week. I find the bar shifted a hand's width further each morning, though I set it fresh myself before sleeping. I do not know if I am protecting my family from what is inside, or keeping something patient long enough that it forgets to be angry. I have started to wonder if Cross wants this land not despite what's under it, but because of it. The entry ended there. There were no pages after it. Eleanor closed the ledger with hands that had gone entirely cold, and for a long moment neither she nor Caleb spoke, both of them listening to the ordinary sound of wind finally returning to the yard outside, as if the night itself were only now remembering how to breathe. Eleanor rode into Redwater the next morning with the ledger wrapped carefully in cloth inside her saddlebag. intending to bring it before the county recorder, a thin, careful man named Otis Graham, who kept the town's official memory in leather-bound books nobody else much wanted to read. She found the office quieter than she expected, Graham himself pale when she explained what she carried. "I remember the Marsh filing," he admitted, once she'd laid the ledger's final pages before him. "The mineral rights transfer went through awful fast after they vanished. Faster than county process generally allows, if I'm honest with you, Mrs. Hayes, which I probably shouldn't be. Fast enough that someone pushed it through," Eleanor said. Graham did not answer directly, which she understood by now was its own kind of answer. "There's a territorial inspector due through next month," he said instead. If discrepancies turned up in the Marsh transfer before he arrived, it wouldn't just embarrass Cross's company. It could undo every mineral claim they've filed in this county for the last decade. "Then I'll make sure discrepancies turn up," Eleanor said. Word of her visit reached Cross faster than she expected. He arrived at Hollowbell that same evening, his carriage driven harder than dignity usually allowed a man like him, dust streaking the fine black paint. He did not bother with pleasantries this time. "You've been asking questions in town," he said, standing in her yard without invitation. "I've been reading a dead man's ledger," Eleanor said. "Your name appears in it. Rather more than sentiment would explain, Mr. Cross." His composure held barely. "Whatever you believe you found, Mrs. Hayes, I'd advise extreme caution before repeating it publicly. Accusations against a company of my standing tend to become very expensive for the person making them." "Is that a threat?" "Same as before. It's a courtesy," he said, "which is more than the Marsh family received and considerably more than you'll receive if you continue down this road." He left without waiting for her reply. And this time, Eleanor noted, he did not look toward the barn at all. Not once, in a way that struck her as more deliberate than any glance would have been. A man, unafraid of a place, did not so carefully avoid looking at it. That night, she and Caleb kept watch together, positioned on opposite sides of the yard, lamps unlit so as not to announce themselves. Near midnight, they caught two shapes moving along the fence line. Men, not spirits, boots crunching audibly on dry grass, one of them carrying a length of rope not unlike the one that had once hung coiled by the barn's trapdoor. Caleb moved first, catching the nearer man by the collar before he could bolt. In the scuffle that followed, Eleanor recognized him, one of Cross's hired hands, a man she'd seen driving the fine carriage on its earlier visits. Under Caleb's grip and Eleanor's rifle both aimed steady, despite her still uncertain hands, the man admitted, stammering, that Cross had paid him and two others to slip onto the property some nights and disturb the stock, to scare a lone widow off land the company wanted badly enough to lie for. "And the bell," Eleanor demanded, "was that you as well?" The man's face went a different kind of pale at the question, fear layered over fear. "No, ma'am," he said, and something in his voice convinced her he was telling the truth about at least that much. "We never once touched that bell. Wouldn't go near the barn after dark for any money Cross offered. That part ain't us. Never has been." So Cross was guilty of one fear, but not the other, a fact that troubled Eleanor more than a single clean explanation would have. She had hoped, she realized, that unmasking Cross's hired men might account for everything, the frightened animals, perhaps, or the shifting bar on the barn door. But the man's terror at the mention of the bell had been genuine, unrehearsed, the fear of someone who understood a limit even greed would not push him past. They released him with a warning and a promise that his confession, along with the ledger, would go before the territorial inspector regardless of what Cross chose to do next. He rode off fast, glancing back at the barn, only once, the way a man glances at a dog he isn't certain is done growling. Caleb turned to Eleanor once the hoofbeats faded. "That settles the matter of Cross," he said. "If the inspector does his job honestly, but it doesn't settle the other matter." "No," Eleanor agreed, looking past him to the barn's black doorway, standing open the exact width that it held for days now, patient as a held breath. "It doesn't settle that at all." They stood together in the dark a long moment, two ordinary fears now separated cleanly from each other, one a matter for law and paperwork, filed and pursued and eventually punished, the other a matter neither of them had any name for, and both, in their different ways, had decided simply to live beside rather than resolve. The following week brought the confrontation Eleanor had been building toward since her visit to Graham's office. She rode into Redwater with the ledger, the hired man's signed statement, and Amos Tillman himself, who had agreed, after much persuasion, to speak plainly about what he'd witnessed during his years working for Josiah Marsh. Cross met them at the land office, his lawyer beside him, his composure a thin, brittle thing he wore like the fine suit that no longer looked quite so immaculate. He denied the hired man's account, denied any knowledge of intimidation, denied everything with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had denied inconvenient truths his entire career. But the ledger spoke for Josiah Marsh in a voice Cross could not talk over, and Amos spoke for the 10 years of silence the county had allowed to settle over a vanished family without ever properly asking why. Graham, to his credit, did not flinch from what the paper trail suggested, and by the time the territorial inspector's early arrival was announced, summoned sooner than expected, once word of the ledger reached the capital, Cross's mineral claims across the county stood frozen pending review. "You've made an enemy of my company, Mrs. Hayes," Cross said quietly, as the meeting broke apart around them, his lawyer already gathering papers with the particular haste of a man distancing himself from a losing cause. "You made an enemy of the truth 10 years before I ever bought that land, Mr. Cross," Eleanor said. "I only happened to be the one who finally read it." He studied her a long moment, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like genuine unease crossed his face. Not fear of the law, she understood, but fear of the ground itself, the thing he had spent a decade trying to buy quietly rather than ever actually uncover. "You should sell that land the moment this settles," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Whatever you think you've won here today, you have not won anything from what's underneath it. Men wiser than either of us learned it the hard way, and I promise you, Mrs. Hayes, their names are not remembered kindly for having stayed." He left without waiting for her answer, and this time Eleanor found she had none ready to give him. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy version of peace. Cross's company retreated from the county entirely once the inspector's review confirmed the irregularities in the Marsh mineral transfer. His claims voided one by one, his name spoken in town now with the particular contempt reserved for men caught rather than merely suspected. Eleanor's ownership of Hollow Bell Ranch stood confirmed, undisputed, entirely her own. And still, some nights, the bell rang. Not every night, not at the same hour with quite the same certainty as before, as though whatever caused it had noticed the changed circumstances of the land above it and adjusted itself accordingly, patient in a way that unsettled Eleanor more than consistency would have. She had the barn door repaired, the bar restored, though she chose deliberately to hang it the same way Josiah Marsh had, barred from the outside, keeping shut whatever preferred to stay in, rather than keeping out whatever might wish to enter. She did not go down the shaft again. She did not fill it in. Either, though. Caleb offered more than once to bring enough men and stone to seal it forever. Something in her resisted the finality of that, a caution she could not fully explain even to herself. Caleb came around often enough in the months that followed that his visits stopped needing an excuse. He never suggested she leave the ranch again, though she suspected some part of him hoped she eventually would. Instead, he helped her fix the fences, rebuild the paddock the horses had once broken in their fright, and sat with her some evenings on the porch, watching the barn the way a person watches a sleeping animal they are not entirely certain is only sleeping. You could still sell, he told her once, not long after the harvest. Nobody would think less of you for it. I know, Eleanor said. I don't intend to. Why not? She considered the question longer than he likely expected. Because someone has to stay and watch it, she said finally. Josiah Marsh watched it for 11 years before whatever happened to his family happened. 10 years passed with no one watching at all, and in that silence, Cross nearly bought the whole truth of this county and buried it for good. I'd rather be the one keeping watch than leave that job to whoever comes next with less reason to ask questions. Caleb did not argue the point further. He only nodded and reached for her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and neither of them pulled away. Amos Tillman visited once more before the first snow, bringing with him nothing but a single question he said had followed him 11 years without answer. Do you regret it? He asked her. Buying this place, knowing now what you know? Eleanor considered the barn, the bell hanging silent and still in the daylight, the shaft sealed beneath its trapdoor, patient and unexplained. I regret that a family disappeared here, and no one asked why for 10 years, she said. I regret that a man like Cross nearly profited from that silence. But the land itself. She paused, searching for words that would not sound foolish spoken aloud. I don't think this land did anything to the Marsh family that it hasn't been doing quietly since long before any of us arrived to give it a name. I think we simply built a life on top of a very old, very patient question. And some of us get frightened when a place refuses to answer. Amos studied her with something like respect and something like sorrow in equal measure. Josiah used to say near the same thing, he said, right before the end. He did not say it as a comfort, and Eleanor did not take it as one. Winter passed, and spring came slow and pale over the hills, and Hollow Bell Ranch settled into something that resembled ordinary life. If ordinary life could be said to include a barn, no one entered after dark, and a bell that rang, on occasion, to no hand Eleanor had ever seen pull its rope. She kept Josiah Marsh's ledger locked in a drawer of her own. Now, its final unfinished entry, a reminder she did not need repeated but chose to keep close, regardless. She added pages of her own to it, in time, small, careful notes about the nights the bell rang and the nights it did not, the hours, the weather, whether the horses had stirred. Not out of scholarly interest, she told herself, but so that whoever came after her, if anyone ever did, would not have to begin, as she had, entirely in the dark. Caleb asked her, that spring, to marry him on an evening ordinary enough that she nearly missed the question inside it. She said yes before she had fully considered what it meant to build a life beside a question with no answer, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not mind the arrangement nearly as much as caution suggested she ought to. On the night before their wedding, Eleanor could not sleep and found herself once more at the upstairs window, watching the yard the way she had that first frightened night nearly a year before. The barn stood black against the stars, door barred, bell hanging silent and still in air, too calm to move it on its own. Midnight came and went without incident, and she allowed herself, for the first time in months, something close to peace. Then, just past the hour, a single toll rang out across the yard, heavy, deliberate, unhurried, followed, after a long pause, by a second. She did not run. She did not call for Caleb, sleeping in the next room, nor reach for the rifle propped by the door. She only sat at the window, watching the barn's black shape against the stars, waiting to see if a third toll would follow the first two, the way it always had before. It did not come. The night settled back into silence, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had been the very first evening she arrived, as though something out there had merely wanted, once more, to be certain she was still listening. She was.